continue later. Sorry about
Okay.
that.
No, I think we're recording now, so that's all good. So okay, so yeah, thank you. This evening I'm going to be talking about Swindon before the railway, though actually that's a slightly misleading title. What I should have really called it was Swindon before the railway and before the canal, because it's really, I think, with the construction of the Wiltshire and Berkshire Canal in 1804, that the nature of the town of Swindon started to change, and of course that accelerated when the railway came along. And tonight my talk focuses very much on the pre-industrial period and on the ancient settlement on the hill. I first became interested in the history of Swindon over 20 years ago when I moved here from Somerset. I quickly realised, as one does, that there's a lot of 19th century Swindon history to explore. But because I was trained as a medievalist, I immediately thought, well, you know, what happened before then? I also spotted the fact that Old Town was called Old Town, and that was kind of a clue, which intrigued me. So I began to research the history of Swindon, and in fact that research still carries on all the time. I'm still discovering new aspects of Swindon history, and I find it completely fascinating that a town like Swindon has got so much almost hidden history that not a lot of people know about, although I know some people here tonight know a very great deal. I'm going to be talking, this talk is a sort of an evolving one, but I'm going to be talking this evening for about 45 minutes, and I'm very happy to take questions at the end if there are any. And I'm really going to be focusing, I think, more on how certain aspects of the history of Swindon. It wouldn't be possible to talk about the whole of it in 45 minutes. And so I'll just be looking at certain aspects during that period of time and talking about those as we go along. Right, I'm trying to move my slides on, which now they're not doing. Ah, there we go. Here we have a partial map of Swindon from the 18th century, which I think is absolutely wonderful. It shows some of the smaller manors, the parcels of land such as Westcott and Eastcott, that formed the original nucleus of Swindon in early medieval times. It also has some lovely details, such as the direction post and down on the marsh. And of course, the smallpox house down here, which was built in the 18th century, and lovely little drawings of Swindon House, and I think that's probably Billet House down there, the mill and the church. It's an absolutely lovely, detailed map of the town, and it was made in the 18th century. But obviously, a lot of the features on there that predate that. And if you read the conventional history books of Swindon, on the evolution of, sorry, not the conventional history books of Swindon, the conventional history books about the development of towns and urban life, either Swindon isn't mentioned at all, or there's a very small amount said about it. I discovered this early on. This is a quotation from the well-known architectural historian Mark Girouard in his book, The English Town. He said, Swindon was virtually a new town that grew up around the railway. That is the only line in the book that refers to Swindon at all, and if it were true, there would be nothing to talk about this evening. Alternatively, we could turn to a very different publication, William Morris's Swindon of about 50 years ago, written in 1885, which he freely admits is a collection of stories about the town and not a formal history. Which he said would be impossible to write because, and again I quote, there is absolutely no material for such a purpose. Well, somewhere between these two positions, I think, is a rich and fascinating history of a village that grew into a town over a period of more than 1,000 years. So where does the recorded history of Swindon begin? Well, we know from architectural, if not written evidence, that the hill on which Old Town was built has been inhabited for a very long time. Archaeological finds from the prehistoric, Bronze Age and Roman periods all give an insight into the people who have been living there down the centuries. There is some debate about the derivation of the name Swindon. Some say it's Norse, derived from Swain's Doon, or meaning village, but I think it's more likely that it comes from the Anglo-Saxon for swine doon, swine down, hence the illustration of the Gloucester old spot, a pasture for pigs. And like a number of other local villages, though, Swindon isn't mentioned by name in any Anglo-Saxon charters, so we can't be certain that it was we know it was a settlement at that time, because again there's archaeological evidence for it, but there isn't any written mention of the name in that period. But as I say, we know that there was a Saxon village in Swindon, or Swindon was a Saxon village, and life there would have been pretty hard, I think. Most Saxon settlements were very small. There were fewer than 100 people. They had to be self-sufficient in many ways. Houses were built with out of wood and thatch, and there was one room that the family would be sharing with the pigs and the other animals as well. In terms of food and clothing, they had to provide everything that they needed themselves, and the people would farm the land in long strips of fields and grew arable crops as well as keeping their animals. A village would also have a few craftsmen who had essential specialised skills, and one of these would have been the blacksmith, and I think this is a really significant point, because you can trace the history of there being blacksmiths in Swindon all the way through this 1,000 years, which I think is quite extraordinary. The blacksmith at this point would have made knives, swords, as well as shoes for horses. And there would also have been people like craftsmen like woodturners, leatherworkers. We've got a bit of, we okay there? And we know that these crafts existed in medieval Swindon and began many centuries before. The peace and prosperity of a Saxon village, of course, in this particular region was under threat by the 9th century, because the Vikings were literally on the horizon. They had previously engaged in hit and run raids on centres of wealth, such as monasteries. But by 865, things had changed. The Great Danish Army, which was the force that invaded this part of the country, had the aim of occupying and settling territory. So they weren't interested in coming along and stealing things and running away again. They wanted to settle, and they took every kingdom in the 7 kingdoms of what was Britain at the time, until only Wessex was left. And this area where Swindon is situated was right on the borderline of where the fighting was taking place. It wasn't, in fact, until 878 that King Alfred, of course, finally defeated the Danes at Eddington, which is near Westbury. So they had got that far west, and they agreed to withdraw northwards from here. This may be where the idea that Swindon has got a Norse name came from, because, of course, there was quite a lot of activity with the great heathen army, as it was known, around here. But after that, there was a period of relative peace, which allowed the village to develop into the settlement that is described for the first time in a written record in the Domesday Book of 1086. The Domesday records that before the Norman conquest, Swindon had belonged to a Saxon nobleman called Leofgeat, but we don't know anything about him, whether he fought or fell at Hastings. He certainly wasn't in evidence after 1066. Instead, we had sorry, I don't know. Oh, there we go. My slides are being very awkward tonight. So instead, we had this fellow who's called Woddard. Now, we do know that after the Norman conquest, Swindon was divided into 5 separate manors, and these were owned by a number of Norman landowners. The most significant of these was Odo, the Bishop of Bayeux, who was the half-brother of William the Conqueror. And he sublet his land of Swindon to Woddard, who's quite an interesting person, because he is one of very few named men to feature in the Bayeux tapestry. Here he is He was a Norman nobleman who was in the army at Hastings, and in this particular slide from the tapestry, he's pictured out on a foraging expedition. The Domesday Book states that his land at Swindon comprised of 5 hides. Now, a hide was roughly 30 acres, and this was divided into arable, pasture, meadowland, and at the time he had 11 feudal tenants of different ranks, and his land was worth £4, which very roughly, because it's hard to compare prices, of course, then and now, it was the equivalent of about £5,000 in today's money. And there were a number of other Norman landowners who also owned other parts of the 5 manors of Swindon, and at that time 2 mills were also recorded. Going forward into the medieval period, Swindon was known by what I consider to be my favourite version of its name, which was Swindon super Montem. I really feel we should readopt the Latin for Swindon because it sounds so impressive, but of course basically really all it meant was Swindon over the hill, and in time this became known as High Swindon. It prospered as a town in the early medieval period because by that stage it was one of the manors that belonged to William de Valence, who was the Earl of Pembroke. He was half-brother of King Henry III. And incidentally, a factoid that I learned the other day and very keen to share with everybody, William's nickname was Strongbow, and the Strongbow cider was named after him. And given the theme of how many pubs there were in Swindon through this period, I think that's quite appropriate, really. But William de Valence was enormously wealthy and powerful. He owned hundreds of estates, of course, scattered across England, and in many cases would never visit them. But we do know that he visited Swindon. There is a record, in fact, of the Countess of Pembroke visiting the manor for 2 months on her way to Goodrich Castle in Herefordshire in 1297. And this is very interesting because, of course, it suggests that there was a substantial enough manor house in Swindon in that period at the end of the 13th century to house a major noble family, a retinue as well. And we also know, hence the slide, that there was a deer park here at the same time. So the actual the site of where this house was probably would have been next to the church where the subsequent manor houses were, but we don't know that for sure, and I'll come back to that in a minute. We do know as well that William de Valence made deliberate attempts to develop Swindon as an urban centre, so he had a policy of making the town grow, and this was not for altruistic reasons, of course, but because he wanted to make more money from taxes. So he was the one who first asked the king for a licence to establish a market in the town in 1259, and that flourished. 30 years later, it's referred to as Chipping Swindon, chipping being, of course, the old English word for to buy. Now, if we take a look at the layout of medieval Swindon, obviously this is a modern map with the dentist and the car parks marked on it, but it does show how Old Town today is still structured around the medieval layout of the roads, and that the core of the medieval town is hidden beneath the modern exterior. Newport Street is in fact the first recorded named road in Old Town, and we have a date of that from 1346, and it is a record of the medieval market, because port, the new port meant the new market, port being a market town, a place where goods are transported and sold. Slightly confusingly for those of us trying to trace the development of names, it was also known as Bull Street at some point during its history because the Bull Inn was situated on there. And this was the road on which many of the poorest of Swindon's inhabitants would live, the shoemakers, the bakers, the poorer artisan workers. Later, in the 18th century, the parish lockup, known as the Black Hole of Swindon, was situated at the western end of Newport Street. And prisoners would be kept there in a dark single cell before more permanent arrangements could be made for housing them elsewhere. The market square itself was here to the east of what is now the High Street. And that, in its earliest incarnation, would have been filled with movable booths and stalls on market days and on days when the fairs were held. There was, we know, a wooden market cross in the centre, which was still in place by the 17th century, but disappeared by the 18th. Over the centuries, this open market square area would gradually have become surrounded by buildings, first cottages and then later on larger both houses, bigger houses, but also industrial buildings, corn stores, that kind of thing. And this was also where the rectory was, on the south side of the market square. Wood Street, of course, is another of the old roads of Swindon, and the name was first recorded in 1599. Also, again, Wood Street was known colloquially as Windmill Street, almost certainly because there was a windmill on the site of the King's Arms pub. And it was also known as Blacksmiths Street, as I mentioned. Throughout the whole of the succeeding centuries, there were always blacksmiths in Swindon. And of course, the thing about street names is, like surnames, in the medieval period, they were fixed. So you just say to someone, I'll meet you at the inn in Bull Street or whatever, and you had to kind of work out where people were talking about. Wood Street, like Newport Street, was another of the poorer areas of the town in the early days, with small thatched cottages. The labourers and the artisans lived there. Now, one intriguing mystery is the building that was situated on the corner of Wood Street and Albert Street, right up until the 1960s, I understand. And this was of medieval origin, and this is it was refaced. It had a Georgian frontage put on it, but it was known, apparently, I mean, I'm told it was known as the Manor House. Now, nobody can explain that, and of course, one potential explanation, which, unless we find some documentation, we'll never know, but that could have been the original site of the 13th century manor house, if it hadn't been on the site of the lawn. Let's hope we can find the answer to that one day. The High Street is also named in documents from the 16th century, but we know it was in existence much, much earlier. For example, number 16 High Street is a 17th century house, but it was built on a medieval footing, on a medieval foundation, a burgage plot as it was known. And this was an area that the lord of the manor allocated to a merchant as a tenant to set up their shop and their home behind that. And they tend to be very long and narrow. And you can still actually see in Swindon the footprint of some of these with the little alleyways next to them, which was how you would get round the back of your burgage plot without having to go through the house. Before the 18th century, this was also where the principal inns of the town could be found. The Goddard Arms, there on the right-hand side, was built on the site of a 16th century inn called the Crown. And it's possible that the Crown, standing as it is beside the entry to the manor house, was the very first inn in the town, run. I mean, the town may have had a Roman inn. A lot of places did, but we know for certain it would have had one that was run when the church belonged to the priory. So I'll come on to that in a moment, but certainly it's a strong possibility, and that's emphasised by the fact that it was called the Crown in the 16th century, because that was the time after the dissolution of the monasteries under Henry VIII. There's a lot of pubs that were previously called other things very loyally changed their names to things like the Crown or the King's Head, just to prove how loyal they were now to the King rather than to the church. Other important elements of Old Town in this period were the horse fair at the northern end of what's now the Devizes Road, and the mill, of course, which was situated in what was known as Lower Town, and now on the Marlborough Road. So medieval Swindon might not have been huge, but it was a thriving market town, and it was also a borough, which meant that it had been granted self-government by the Crown. It was allowed to elect its own MPs, which it did for the Parliament of 1295. and it also held quarter sizes. So it was not the somnolent backwater that it's sometimes made out to be. For example, in 1335, we've got a note of the number of inhabitants of the town, and it was comparable at that stage in size and wealth to Devizes. So it was flourishing. The mill in Swindon obviously was central to the town's economic life for centuries. We know it already existed in 1086 because it's mentioned in the Domesday Book. And the upper mill pond was here, just below where the church was, in this rather lovely picture here. Examples of water mills have in fact been found dating right back to the Romano-British time. So it's entirely possible again that the first mill could have dated from that time, but probably more likely that the first mill in Swindon would have been built in the Saxon period. And Swindon was on the spring line, which obviously facilitated the supply of water to the mill. One of the things I think it's so interesting about the landscape around that part of Old Town now is that although the mill has gone, you can still see very clearly the footprint of where it was in the landscape on that quite steep slope going downhill from this point, and the ponds that are still there that were part of the watercourses that fed the mill. The Planks, of course, is just along the road from there, and that also owes its name to the Swindon Springs, because a raised causeway of flagstones or plank stones had to be built leading from the town towards the church in order to allow people to arrive in their Sunday best without getting wet or dirty from the spring water. And of course, the very fact that the Goddards of Swindon House also had their stables along this road meant that the actual roads paths, really tracks, would get churned up and very dirty. Swindon House, yes, later known as the Lawn, another lost aspect of old Swindon. The house in this slide is the most recent incarnation of the home of the Goddard lords of the manor. Of course, it was demolished in 1952. It was a late Georgian building from the 1770s, very grand, with the orangery and the Italianate garden in front of it. And this style of garden was particularly popular and fashionable in the mid-Victorian period. There was a very similar one at Ashdown House, near where I live, just up the road from Swindon, near Lambourne, and I've got a picture of the garden at the Lawn and a picture of the garden at Ashdown, and they're very, very similar. But prior to the 18th century mansion, there had been an older house on this site that was built in the 1650s, and before that, the manor that was already standing when the Goddards bought the estate in 1563. Now, that could have been the original medieval manor, but it would have been pretty old by then. And given the penchant people had, as they still do, for always rebuilding and repairing and building on the same plot, it may be that there was, as I mentioned earlier, the first manor was elsewhere. But it was certainly a traditional arrangement for the manor house and the church to be next to each other, because this then focused the power and authority in the spiritual and the temporal reign of the town side by side, if you like. And yes, the Church of Holy Rood. There are references. I mean, I absolutely love the Church of Holy Rood. I think the ruin of it is still very beautiful, and the history of it is fascinating. There are references to a church on this site from 1154. Originally, it was called St Mary's because it belonged to St Mary's Augustinian Priory in Southwick in Hampshire. That was the bit of the church that owned it, and that's where it took its name from. It was altered again, like houses are. Almost every century, something new was done to the church. It changed its name to the Holy Rood after the dissolution. And in this slide, you can see some of the remains that survive above the ground, including the chancel there on the left, and the pairs of stone piers which flank the nave, and some of the surviving flooring. The north doorway also survives in the form of the current entry into the church. It was remodelled in the 13th and the 14th centuries, and again repaired and remodelled right up until the 18th century when a tower was added. In fact, they were still adding bits onto it, and particularly the interior, right up until the time when it was demolished. William Morris described it by the 19th century as the most insignificant ecclesiastical building in the whole neighbourhood, and it was moreover hopelessly out of condition. It probably was both of those things by the time that we get to 1852, and I have no doubt that Christ Church is much grander. But the fact is, we have in Swindon the ruins of the church that has traces of its Norman origins, and I think that should be treasured. The 16th century was a great time of expansion in the town, in trade, and some towns grew exponentially in the period, but not Swindon, interestingly. It had a modest population of about 300 people at the start of the 17th century, so it hadn't grown very much throughout the previous 100 years. Probably two of the main reasons for this were the fact that there was no longer a powerful vested interest from a really big noble family as there had been in the time of the de Valences. The Goddards and the Villettes were prominent gentry families, but they weren't as influential. And also, of course, a road system was developing, which in a lot of ways passed Swindon by. The major routes from east to west and north to south didn't run through the town. It wasn't unconnected to the outside world. We do know that there were mail coaches running to and from London from the 16th century. But it wasn't on a major trade route, and that made a really big difference, I think, to the growth of the town. One of the things that did flourish in Swindon in the Tudor period was the pubs. There was the Crown, of course, as I mentioned earlier, and the Lapwing, which later became the Bell, which was reputed to have been built in 1515 and possessed a classic Tudor galleried upper story. It's the Lapwing that's tied by folklore, if not by authenticated history, to the idea of Swindon as a centre for smuggling. I've studied all of the stories and the folklore about the Swindon smuggling. It's all absolutely fascinating. But it's said that in the later part of the 16th century, Flemish wine and spirit merchants established themselves in the town, and that the Lapwing was their preferred drinking house. Missing their favourite tipple of Dutch gin, it was said that they imported it illegally. The contraband trade allegedly continued to flourish into the 17th and 18th centuries, when Swindon became home to a band of moonrakers, smugglers who imported brandy and stored it in the tunnels beneath the old town. Now, that's a very kind of brief summary of the legends of the moonrakers, and there's lots of different stories about them. It's a great story, and it grieves me tremendously that I can't find any historical evidence to support it. I do think a historian can make a very good circumstantial case for Swindon as a centre of smuggling, and I have done some work on this myself, but until I can find facts to support the supposition, I have to say that it's unproven. What is recorded fact, however, is that by 1627 there were 9 licensed alehouses in Swindon, and there's a rather amusing pious reference from the town constables at the time, saying they felt that this was rather too large a number for a town of only 300 people. This is Robert Devereux, Earl of Essex, and I've brought him in to illustrate another aspect of Swindon history that I think frequently gets overlooked, which is what happened in this area during the English Civil Wars. And Wiltshire was in the heart of the action during that period, particularly during the 1640s. And when considering the effects of something like the Civil War on a small place like Swindon, historians have often been quite dismissive. Again, that the one reference that you usually find is the occasion when the Earl of Essex and his parliamentarian troops supposedly stayed at the Lapwing on their way to the First Battle of Newbury in 1643. Now, that happened, but I think this is to discount the effect of civil wars generally on any civilian populace, and particularly one in an area as heavily fought over as the West Country was. Even before the Civil War began, in this particular area, there was the threat of press gangs who were looking to force soldiers into the King's army. And in Wiltshire in particular, and in the Vale of the White Horse, these heavy-handed recruiters complained to the King that it was impossible to find able-bodied men to fight. The fact is that clearly Wiltshire people were very canny. All men of fighting age had either been hidden by their families or by the landowners who didn't want to lose their workforce. But the press gangs were combing this area for able-bodied men. During the Civil War, things didn't get any easier for the population either. Armies lived basically off the countryside, and that was particularly hard on counties like Berkshire and Wiltshire because there were garrisons on both sides, royalist and parliamentarian, and soldiers fought skirmishes all over this region. Towns like Swindon were very much in the firing line. They would be left devastated when an army passed through because it would take all their livestock, their food and their supplies. So Essex's soldiers didn't just drop in at the Lapwing and have a pint and spend the night there. When they left, they took all the food, they took all the horses, and to add insult to injury, they didn't pay for any of it either. So it was that kind of an experience, which is devastating for a small economy. Brigadier Peter Young, in an article about the Civil War in Wiltshire, described some of the other effects, I think, very well, and I'll just briefly quote him here. From the time that the Royalists captured Marlborough, they seem to have done what they could to control the county. They used small garrisons, a couple of hundred men and about 25 cavalry in one house. The cavalry would go out at night, patrolling around. You wouldn't want to be in their way when they were out. They lived off the country, and not to put too fine a point on it, by plundering. They would come back again, bringing with them whatever the country provided, cheese, cattle, anything that they could find. So under the circumstances, it was probably no surprise that when you look at the records for the mid-17th century, after the restoration of King Charles II, that the town was really struggling. And these here in the slide are tradesmen's tokens from the middle of the 17th century. These were in place of coinage. They would be issued by merchants at a time when there was an acute shortage of actual coins of state, simply to be able to enable trade to take place. So the token would effectively be a pledge redeemable against goods, probably not against money. And in Swindon, we have a record of both Henry Munday, who was a chandler, and Amos Wilkins, a grocer, issuing coins like this in order to be able to carry on their business. One trade that had continued in Swindon on and off since Roman times, in fact, was quarrying. And as early as the 14th century, slates from Swindon quarries were being used to roof the cottages in the town. But at the end of the 17th century, the middle of the 17th to the end of the 17th century, quarriers in Swindon struck a particularly high quality seam of Purbeck limestone to the west of the town, which led to an increase in prosperity and in population. And John Aubrey, a well-known antiquarian who was based in Oxford during the period, commented that Swindon stone was good enough for interiors of aristocratic houses, even in London, he said, being white, smooth, taking a little polish and remaining dry even in wet weather. And here is the hallway of Ashdown House, not in London, of course, but near Lambourne. You can see when this was built in the 1660s, they used the high quality Swindon stone in the hallway here, and you can still see that in situ now. The stone quarries were actually worked as individual, separate small businesses, and by the 18th century, there were 9 families of quarriers in Swindon. Run on that particular basis, it wasn't really a very lucrative trade. For example, in 1700, one of the quarries was sold for £14, which is about £1,500 in today's money. And the seam of fine quality stone finally ran out. by the end of the 18th century, although the quarrying of lesser quality stone continued. Again, this was sent up to London, but this time it was to pave the streets rather than furnish the houses. A list of the inhabitants in Swindon in 1697 shows that the population had more than doubled from the start of the century, with about 800 people and all levels of society represented. So it was a small town, but it was resembling very much the kind of population you would expect to see around the beginning of the 18th century. So at this stage, you had an emerging middle class of shopkeepers and tradesmen. There were artisans and labourers as well, of course. And at the top of the tree, there were the gentlemen who owned property, the Goddards, the Villettes, and other lesser families of that ilk. The number of pubs had also decreased at this point to only 6, but the vicar estimated that out of the 800 inhabitants of Swindon, only 572 went to church, and he felt that this was a bit of a poor show. The sort of crafts and trades that you would find in the town were exactly what you would expect for a thriving market town at the beginning of the 18th century. And we've got a lovely list of who was doing what. Clothiers, shearmen, masons, stone cutters, weavers, including specialist silk weavers, coopers, a glover, felt maker, a cheese factor, particularly like that one, as well as the smiths and carpenters, tailors, drapers, bakers, butchers, and a couple of barbers as well. By the 18th century, the High Street was where the gentry lived and where the most prestigious of the shops were. It had kudos, of course, because it was near the entry to the manor house, and it was therefore known as the polite side of town. And it was also the place you moved to when you made your pile and you wanted to make a bit of a splash. So, for example, we know in 1700 that there was a cotton merchant who lived at Manchester House on the corner of Newport Street and High Street. And he built a grand building with 6 bays, just to show that he could, really, how much money was to be made in cotton in that period. Following on from the development of the middle class and the tradesmen and gentry, of course, came the professional men. So by 1719, there was an attorney, a lawyer in the town who took pupils. And then by the end of the century, there were several lawyers and solicitors. There were 2 surgeon apothecaries, and the range of trades expanded as well. A sign of great gentility was that by the end of the century, Swindon had an upholsterer. And the 18th century was also saw the first provision of public education in Swindon when the free school opened in Newport Street in 1764. Now, this was quite early, a quite enlightened thing to do, particularly as it was funded by voluntary subscription, and it was intended to instruct 20 poor children in religion and in arithmetic, only those 2 subjects. And when I say children, I actually mean boys. But again, very unusually at this period, a specific endowment enabled a few girls as well to be taught in addition to the 20 boys originally provided for. So a big hooray for the enlightenment of Swindon in that time. Still having problems with the slides here. Sorry, moving on. Well, if it won't move on, I shall move on in a moment without, here we go. This, of course, is the Villette House, probably the most well-known. I'm sorry, it's not a very good quality slide. Every time I went to take a photograph of it, the weather was terrible. It has been declared the finest house in Swindon, of course, by no less a person than John Betjeman, and is a very good example of the grand style of architecture that the gentry in the town were building in the 18th century. It was actually a whole pub and several cottages were knocked down in order to build this in 1729. And of course, this is also one of the properties in Old Town that has large barrel vaulted brick-lined tunnels that are sometimes claimed to be part of the underground network of smuggling passages. particularly like the carved stone faces and the masonry at the Villette House. They're very idiosyncratic. One interpretation is that they represent certain people who were prominent in the town at the time the house was built. Other suggestions are that they are actually the faces of the Swindon smugglers who have been carved for posterity into the architecture of the town. I think I'm just going to finish with a few of the activities, well, one of the activities that you could engage in should you happen to have been in Swindon during the 18th century. This is a slide of what was called the Cotswold Games, and William Morris, again, in his book, gives a very enthusiastic description of these kinds of entertainments that were available in Swindon in the 17th and the 18th century. So you can see some of the sports that are indulged in here in Cotswold Olympic Games, including standing on your head and throwing javelins. But of course, the one that was particularly popular in our town was backsword playing. Backswords, in fact, I was a bit disappointed to discover were not actually metal swords usually. Most people, of course, couldn't afford a proper sword, but they were wooden sticks with a hilt, like a sword hilt. And the sport actually began in the 16th century. It had very complicated regional rules, depending on where you came from. But it was basically like sword fighting with cudgels, really. It dropped out of fashion. It was fashionable for 200 years or more, and only dropped out of fashion in the 19th century, when, like many other rural activities, it became viewed as unsophisticated. And I rather like some of the comments about backsword fighting from the 19th century, when it was described as morally inferior, leading to drunkenness and other unsuitable behaviours. However, in the mid-18th century, it was hugely popular, and there were actually revels, fairs, where you could earn a lot of money if you were a good backsword fighter. So you could compete for cash prizes, and in Swindon, there were said to be some extremely talented backsword players. By the start of the 19th century, the population of Swindon had reached 1,200 people, and it was, by all accounts, a most pleasant place to live. John Britton, an antiquary who was born near Chippenham, felt that it had improved a great deal since the previous century, and referred to the politeness of society there in his book, The Beauties of Wiltshire. He said, the pleasantness of its situation, combined with other circumstances, which he doesn't tell us what they were, may have induced many persons of independent fortune to fix their residence at Swindon, and their mansions contribute as much to ornament the town as their social intercourse may be said to animate and enliven it, much as we do today. And I think that's a nice note to finish on, so thank you very much. I'm very happy to take any questions if there are any, if I can work out how that works on here.
Right, brilliant. Well, I've unmuted myself, Nicola, and I wonder if we get rid of the images, we could see more people. I'm still not sure whether people can put their hands up and ask questions. Do people want to try, put their hands up and then mute themselves? But because we can only see some of the people, we've got a chat thing here. Fascinating. Thanks very much, Kay.
Oh, thank you very much.
Is there a question out there? Is that Angela with a hand up? Yeah? Yes, unmute yourself then. Angela's asking a question.
No, I wasn't. I was just fiddling with my sleeve.
All right. Don't move.
Yeah, sorry. Oh, God. I could have bought something then, couldn't I?
Okay, I'll kick off then, if I may.
Thank you.
I could have bought a painting or something then, couldn't I?
If I may kick off my question. One of the slides, the early slides you showed, was of this gentleman called Woddard.
Yes, yeah.
In the Bayeux Tapestry. Well, is it an absolute coincidence that that's a very similar name to Goddard?
That's very interesting, isn't it?
Yes.
I hadn't made that connection at all. Well, I think that's very, very interesting, because we do know quite a lot about Woddard, because of him being one of the very few people who was featured in the tapestry, and we know that he was a nobleman from actually he wasn't French, I think, but he was one of the mercenaries. What I don't know is what happened to him afterwards, whether he settled, and so whether that family could have descended from his line. Of course, we do know that the inheritance of the manor of Swindon didn't directly go down from him all the way to the Goddards, but I must look into that. I'm fascinated to know whether or not there is a connection there. I will definitely check that out, and I'll let you know.
Thank you. Could I come back on it? I mean, Woddard, the name sounds like it could be Flemish.
Yes, that's
it could have been pronounced Woddard.
Yeah.
So it's a logical. That's an interesting one. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. Oh, thank you, Joe. That would be great.
Any more? Yes, Michael.
Hi, Nicola. Thanks for a lovely talk. It's always kind of interesting. You think you know a lot about the place, and then you learn even more. So I see my neighbour Jeremy down there, and we're in Prospect, and we're constantly doing historical research here, and really we don't get going until 1802 apparently. But there's kind of all sorts of interesting things, but we never managed to find out. And this was known as the down site, or bowling green, because it was so flat. And it was owned by the Goddards before the 19th century. And I just wondered if you've actually ever come across anything about the area. I mean, obviously there was a farm here, but we've never managed to find anything before the 19th century. So I just wondered if you'd had anything to tell us, really.
Oh, how interesting. That's very interesting about a bowling green as well, because that could be sort of 16th, 17th century, 16th century. I've probably got something in my notes, but not right in front of me here. But yeah. I would have a look at that, because I feel sure there must be something that we can find out to predate the 19th century, and I would love to be able to see if I can help sort of fill out any of that history for you. It's interesting though, isn't it? I mean, there are some big gaps, and that's something that I come across, or perhaps it's not so much big gaps, but more only small bits of information, and very specific to individual parts of the town. But so I haven't, unfortunately, I'm sorry, off the top of my head, I haven't got anything I can add to it now. But I would certainly love to have a look at it and find out. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Can I ask Nicola about your books? Are all your books historical, or are they? I'm sorry, I haven't even looked that up. Could you tell us something about your books?
Well, this is the one that's based on Swindon history, The Woman in the Lake. They're all dual times. So there's these are the fictional ones. There's a modern day, a contemporary story, and then a historical story. So this one is set in the 18th century, and those people who read it will know that I take off my historian's hat and put on my novelist hat at that point, and draw very heavily on the smuggling rumours and folklore for that story, because obviously it's a gift to a novelist, and that's why I think I could probably make quite a good case for Swindon being a centre of smuggling, because I have actually researched it quite a lot for that particular book. The other books that I've written are all, again, dual time and set around this local area. So this was the first one, House of Shadows. I'm sure you'll recognise Ashdown House on the front of that one. So that's about the history of Ashdown. And also this one is about Marlborough and Savernake Forest and the Seymours. So yes, they're all books with a local history element to them, which I absolutely love researching the history of our area. So I've so many stories to draw on to write about. And thank you for asking.
Yeah, I just wondered. And I'm just going to ask one more and then let somebody else ask a question. I'm not quite clear. When you were saying that you could see remnants of where the mill was.
Yes.
I mean, could you just be a bit clearer about that? I mean, I'm aware of springs all over the place, but I've not seen any remnants of the mill. I've noticed.
Sorry, I hope I didn't mean to give the impression that there was any building remains left, because there isn't. But if you go to where the mill stood, so if you go, I mean, I'm not great on the geography of Swindon because I can't remember what all the roads are called, but I guess if you go along the planks, somebody else will be able to help here. And there's a road, is that Mill, there's Mill Lane?
Mill Lane.
It is Mill Lane.
Yes. So,
I mean,
there's below where the church wall stands, where the church was, where the top pond was, there's a whole, if you were not a landscape archaeologist, you would know immediately. There's a whole series of features, topographical features in the ground that show where the top pond was, where the water ran down to where the mill was, and then there's a lower pond, and then if you continue around in the park, there's further water courses around there. So that is where you can see how that flow of water ran. I think Andy Binks explained this much better to me when I was doing the tour. I'll have to take everybody round there and show them, because that's how I saw what he meant by that. But if you go to that bit of Swindon and you walk down that path by the side of where the lawn, where the parkland is, behind where the church was, you can see that quite clearly in the landscape. It's really interesting.
Yeah, thank you.
I think the way to think about it is that the spring source came out from underneath the sunken Italian garden and then fell down the hill.
Yes.
Right.
And it basically formed the platform that is the churchyard.
Yeah.
And that was a natural prominence from the spring, and that's why religious sites were there from whenever.
Okay, thank you. Yes. Oh, Alan. Oh, sorry. Yes.
Janice, yeah. All really interesting, Nicola. Thank you so much. I'm just sitting here in Goddard Avenue and noticed from your initial map the smallpox house register.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
And I wondered if you know exactly where that was in terms of current topography, or is there anything of it left?
No, I need to, as far as I know, there's no sign of it left, but I do need to come along and see if I can see any trace at all. As I understand it, it was, again, like so many bits of old Swindon, it was demolished. So I'd really love to take that map, actually, and go round New Swindon, seeing if I could work out where these places were and kind of match them up, because that would be really, really interesting to know. I mean, Swindon and indeed lots of other little villages, like my own village of Ashbury and places like that, all had their own, what were called pest houses, in fact, and they were originally built in the 17th century, usually for the plague, to isolate people who had the plague. So I think most of them were either repurposed or knocked down in the 19th, when sort of hygiene and things like that were supposed to have been improved anyway. But no, I think one day we should do a tour of Swindon using that old map and going around all the places like the direction post and the pest house and seeing if we can actually mark them on the ground now, because it would be fascinating.
Yeah, thanks, yeah.
Right. Are there any more? Oh, right. Are there any more things? I'm trying to read the chats now. Are there any more questions? Anyone want to say anything more? Yes, Gwyneth. Can you? Yes.
Yeah, I've just unmuted myself. And the original map, Nicola, it's Hocus.
Oh, yes.
What on earth is Hocus?
Well, we think it was Ocus. but I mean, again, because of
yeah.
well, we think that's right because of the it's fairly close in terms.
But is it just a name?
Yes. So it was an area that is that's now given its name to Oakers. It's lost its H, but that's what we think, which I think is really charming. But again, we have to.
Well, I thought Hocus Pocus.
Yes, I thought that when I first saw it, and actually somebody else said to me, "Oh, well, that must be Oakers, mustn't it? Because it's in the right, it's in the right place." But I mean, I think that's just a lovely example of how these things change and mutate over time.
Yes, it is fascinating. And if you go on a tour with your map, I'd love to come with you.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think that would be absolutely excellent, wouldn't it? Right, that, you know, that's something to be done when we can gather in mass.
Allowed out.
Mass not yet, obviously. So I think that's probably all questions, although it might not, because I can only see half the people. But I'm going to say, Nicola, thank you so much for coming tonight. That was really, really interesting.
Thank you for inviting me.
And thank you, thank you so much for everybody for coming along. It was a lovely evening. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nicola.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Right, thank you, Nicola. Fabulous.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Out of this.